So Brendan, you've gone through the journey of building a company, getting it funded, ultimately selling it to Bain Capital. For many of the audience who are going through their first capital raise, maybe contemplating having private equity now invest in their company, can you share any insights, pros and cons about the process and what you learned from it?
Yeah, the first thing I'd say is make sure you have a process. So what I mean by that, every once in a while you might get approached by, one potential investor group, one private equity firm, one venture capital firm, whatever. And you kind of get enamored with them and you say, wow, like I really like them, and you go with them. I think that's great. But what I'd say is run a process. Bring in an investment bank, bring in, depending on your size of company, you could bring in a business broker, but really get a chance to meet multiple companies. And I think when you do that, you'll actually find like different companies offer you different things. Some will offer you money on great terms. Another one will offer you money and resources. Another one will offer you money, and they have 4 other portfolio companies that do very similar things that if you were to come together and create, one company. So I always try, first of all, to run a process. By the way, when you run a process, you also tend to get better terms because they know it's competitive. And I think, if they know it's competitive, it's sort of like if you've ever sold before, the second you say procurement's involved, you're like, oh, procurement's involved. Like, that, okay, I got to sharpen my pencil. I got to get a better deal. So if you're giving away equity or you're paying, debt at a certain rate, you're going to get a better deal if you run a process. But I think you're going to get a better partner because you're really going to have met different people across different backgrounds. I remember, when we sold merchants, it was Bain Capital and the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, ADIA. I had never interacted with ADIA before. I hadn't pitched them, and they have nearly $1 trillion, and they're extremely patient capital. So, and they had also owned a competitor of ours that had sold earlier, so they knew the industry. So I said, not only am I getting somebody who's going to be patient, not only am I going to get somebody who has unlimited resources, virtually unlimited resources, I'm going to get somebody who actually understands what we do. But if you had asked me at the beginning of the process, hey, write all the companies down that you think would be good, I never would have put them on a piece of paper. So run a process. Second is know what you want. Like, know what you want out of it. Because sometimes you get enamored with, one company, you get enamored with the process, you get enamored with something. I had a friend that they sold their business. It was a family-owned business, and they sold it to arguably the largest food conglomerate in the world. And a year later, I saw him. Our kids played lacrosse together, and I said, how's it going? He goes, horrible. It's going horrible. Like, they changed our brand. They did this. They did this. Now, and I never said this, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, of course they did. You sold it to the biggest conglomerate in the world. So I think they got enamored with maybe the purchase price, but they didn't think that they wanted their family's name to continue on their product. And by the way, I wasn't involved in the process, so I don't know if that was important or not important. But know what's important to you, because if you pick A, you might get it. But if you pick B and you sell to a very large institution, you aren't going to have the say that you might have if you sold to a different type of organization. So make sure you're clear on what you want. And then third is, have an exit plan for yourself. So, I agreed to stay on 2 years after selling. I thought, hey, I ran it for 5, another 2. And at some point, I think it's just good to bring in another voice. And so, I had an exit plan, and then I had my exit plan. And I think that's important so that you kind of know when to step away and do it in a positive way.